Thank you very much. There's lots to discuss this morning, so let's bring in independent senator from Maine, Angus King. He is a member of the Intelligence and Armed Services Committee. Good morning, Senator.
Good morning, Allison. How are you?
I'm well. Let's start with what happened yesterday on Capitol Hill. You had a very interesting exchange with DNI James Clapper, where you basically said, prove it. What is your evidence that the Russians were behind this? Let me play this for everyone.
Now, people in Maine are skeptical and they want to have evidence and proof, and I'm hearing from people, prove it.
We have invested billions, and we put people's lives at risk to glean such information. And so if we were to fulsomely expose it in such a way that would be completely persuasive to everyone, then we can just kiss that off, because we'll lose it.
Senator, what about that answer? Will that satisfy your constituents in Maine?
Well, I think there are a couple of levels on this. As the reporter just mentioned, there are going to be classified briefings. There was one yesterday to the president, today to Mr. Trump. The Congressional Oversight Committee, the Intelligence Committee, will get classified briefings. There'll be a public briefing. Here's the issue. The intelligence term is sources and methods. If you tell all, if you say, here's how we got it, here's who we got it from, you're compromising your sources and impairing national security, because you won't be able to go back to those sources. People could lose their lives in that situation. The all-time classic case of this was Coventry in World War II.
Yeah.
When Winston Churchill, they broke the German codes. They knew Coventry was going to be bombed. The question was, do we warn Coventry and thereby tip off the Germans we have the codes?
Right.
Churchill made the decision not to give the warning because he didn't want to give away the sources and methods.
Right, but I mean, so given that, how will the skeptics ever be convinced, including Mr. Trump, who meets with them today?
Well, Mr. Trump is going to get the full briefing. He's going to get all the details, and he's going to get what should be persuasive to anyone. The question is how much of that can be made public. He has the highest classification level. He can hear this information without it going public. So that's the issue. The real issue is, how do people in Peoria decide, or people in Bangor, Maine, decide that it's accurate? And at some point, you have to have some confidence in the people whose job it is to collect this information and to provide this to the American public. This is a tough issue. I understand it, but it's one of balance, where if you give away all your sources, then you're compromising national security on an ongoing basis.
Yeah, understood. So, since Mr. Trump will have that fulsome explanation that James Clapper was talking about, what do you expect to hear from Mr. Trump afterwards?
Well, I think that's anybody's guess. My guess is, based upon what I've seen, he's going to have a more sober assessment of what this is all about, and I would suspect a kind of more serious response, saying, now that I've seen all the data, I understand this is a serious problem and we're going to get to the bottom of it. I hope that's his response, because in the long run, these people are his eyes and ears, and to denigrate their work and their sacrifices on behalf of the country isn't going to serve him well in the long run. If he doesn't listen to the people who are experts and professionals and trained to give him this information, who is he going to listen to when he has to make a tough decision?
Senator, I also want to ask you about something else that has developed this morning, and that is the suggestion from some on Mr. Trump's team, and even Mr. Trump in some tweets, that the wall, the border wall with Mexico that he promised, will not at first be paid for by Mexico, as was often suggested during the campaign, but in fact will be funded by Congress and the taxpayers, and then later Mexico will reimburse it. In Congress, will you go along with that?
Well, I think it should be mentioned first that the comprehensive immigration bill that passed the Senate by a bipartisan majority 2 or 3 years ago, the House never brought it up, had in it substantial funds for border security improvements. Bob Corker was the author of that provision, so that opportunity was lost. I have to tell you, though, my first thought this morning was, we'll pay for it and then they'll pay us back. Made me think of repeal and replace Obamacare. We're going to repeal it now and we're going to replace it with something and not tell you what it is. It seems to me that, I always thought it was improbable that Mexico was going to somehow be coerced to pay the tens of billions of dollars that this is going to cost. They said during the campaign specifically they were not. So I
mean,
think if we're going to build a wall, we're going to have to pay for it, and maybe there can be some contribution from Mexico, but it's certainly not anything we can book.
Let's talk about a few developments on the repeal and replace Obamacare front. House Speaker Paul Ryan announced yesterday that the GOP will try to strip all of the federal funding from Planned Parenthood as part of the repeal of Obamacare. Do you think that they have the votes for that? Will that happen?
Well, they'll certainly have the votes for it in the House, and it depends on what form it takes when it comes to the Senate. I've never understood that. If you number one, federal funds don't go for abortions. That's been against the law for, I don't know, 20, 30 years. So this isn't a case of taking money away that's now going for abortions. It's taking money away that now goes for cancer screenings and health checkups and STD analysis and health care for millions of people, women across the country. But the other piece that always I've found ironic is if you don't like abortion, Planned Parenthood and the delivery of contraceptive services is the best way to prevent unwanted pregnancies and pregnancies that might be dangerous, and thereby cut the number of abortions. It seems to me it's a self-defeating move, and it's just the idea of defund Planned Parenthood. But Planned Parenthood does, I don't know, 96-7% of what they do has nothing to do with abortion. So this is, to me, a symbolic gesture that's actually just going to hurt health care for women across the country.
In terms of the repealing of Obamacare, it sounds like the latest plan, I think according to John Cornyn at least, is to repeal it wholesale, which they do have the votes for and Mr. Trump would sign, and then replace it piecemeal. So they like some of the ingredients, some of the parts of the provisions in Obamacare, and they would insert those back into law. What do you make of that plan?
Well, I've always said it ought to be replace and repeal. If they want to repeal, let's see what the replacement is. This is sort of bait and switch kind of thing, and to repeal it. And by the way, repealing it is going to throw the insurance market into chaos. It's going to threaten a lot of people's coverage, something like 30 million people across the country. That's a lot of people. And it's going to threaten rural hospitals. I mean, there are all kinds of ramifications of this that I think the opponents are starting to understand. And that's why I sense there's a bit of, let's just slow down a little bit here, fellas, and see where we're going. Because the results are going to be very, very problematic across the board. So I don't understand, except for trying to, honor a bumper sticker campaign promise, repeal Obamacare. Just slow down, talk about what we're going to do. Yeah. I, for one, have been willing for years to talk about curing some of the defects in Obamacare. Nobody ever said it was a perfect law, but it's always repeal and then we'll talk. I think the talk and the discussion, I think the burden should be on those who want to repeal it to say to the American people, here's how we're going to replace it. Don't give us vague assurances. Here's how it's going to work, because this is very complicated stuff.
Senator Angus King, thank you very much. Always nice to have you on New Day.
Thank you, Allison.
Let's get to Chris.